would like to welcome you warmly, all of you, to this conference webinar on environmental issues and implementation. I have the pleasure to welcome today Dr. José Romero. Dr. José Romero is a high civil servant in the International Affairs Division here in Bern at the Federal Office for the Environment. He is a specialist, he is a scientist. He holds a PhD in physics from the University of Lausanne. He is an expert in all these issues, and he is the Swiss national focal point for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. As you all know, I know that you are all specialists now of all these issues. We just had a module on climate change. That's why I am referring to this. And Dr. José Romero is a government representative in the IPCC Bureau. He is also the Swiss national focal point for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity. And he represents Switzerland in the Group on Earth Observation, GEO. So we are really looking forward to listening to you. So the organization of the webinar is as follows. We have a presentation about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. And the idea is to stop around 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. At the most. So this is the way the session is organized. So Dr. José Romero, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Professor. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to this presentation. I am not a legal person, so in this context, I want to say it from the beginning, but I have a broad experience in these international negotiations. So what we are looking in this presentation is how the international process has led to de facto and also de jure situation where countries are, so to say, internationalizing their environmental policies. You will see how, for example, the Paris Agreement is being mainstream, internationalized at national level in countries. I'll show you something for other treaties. In the next slide, I have 5 big sections of the presentation, and I have put a heading in different colors so you can see when we jump from one section to the other. What I'm going to say is my sole responsibility. It doesn't engage anyhow, it doesn't represent forcefully what the Swiss Confederation thinks and says. So I'm talking as an expert on these matters, but not committing anyhow the Federal Office for the Environment for which I work. Okay, this being said, let's have a look at the global situation. You know, you have heard, you have studied that there are many global environmental problems that are caused by anthropogenic action. You have heard about the ozone layer, halogen compounds that migrate in the stratosphere and destroy the protective ozone. Climate change, because human activities emitting greenhouse gases, CO2, the main greenhouse gas which is emitted worldwide, and biodiversity loss, because we have a lot of resources that are exploited because we are managing the ecosystems and so on. So all these environmental issues are of global nature. And in the next slide, please, next slide, I'm referring to this nature, which is global, of these issues that cannot be solved at the national level and require, therefore, international cooperation and global objectives. The causes, as I mentioned, are mainly anthropogenic. I mean, we have more and more population, we have more and more activities, we have more and more demand for natural resources. We have very inefficient processes. Think, for example, of food. I mean, the UN says that food is wasted in an incredible fraction. I mean, till 20%. So what is produced is wasted. So very inefficient processes. So, as I'm a physicist, I dare mention that the combustion engine of cars is using maybe 15% of the energy that the combustion of gasoline represents. So you see a waste and inefficient processes. So the treaties are of global nature because they intend to solve these problems that are transboundary, that are of global nature. They foster international cooperation and they foster support to those countries that are in a position that don't allow them to make efforts alone without support of finance and technology. So this is a very efficient approach. In the next slide, yes, please, next slide. I'm presenting figures that come from University of Oregon. They have established a wonderful international environmental agreement database. And you see that there are currently more than 1,300 of these multilateral, I use indistinctly unilateral, multilateral, international agreements, but you know what we are talking about. Many bilateral agreements and other regional agreements and so on. Very short extract from the long list of these treaties where this internationalization of these international targets take place is mentioned here: the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biodiversity, the Montreal Protocol, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, Basel Convention on the transboundary movement of hazardous substances, etc., etc. So in the next slide, and yes, the next slide, please. And I'm sorry, I have distorted a little bit by changing it, the labels I put, but you see the incredible ratification and accession to these international treaties by countries. I mean, in the course of the years. Very center, you have after the Rio summit in 1992, these almost immediate ratification of the Climate Convention and the Convention on Biodiversity, and so on. So you see how these global environmental treaties grow in terms of membership. And the mere fact that countries join these treaties is already the first step for what we call in this presentation internationalization of the national environmental policies. In the next slide, please. We have a quick look at the main features of these treaties. The treaties define global objectives, but they allocate, they distribute objectives to each country which ratifies the treaty. So we call these countries the parties. A party to a treaty is a country that has ratified the treaty. So global objectives are distributed, are allocated to countries. No, we stay still there. The second bullet point in the yellow box is showing that the European countries have now these situations where they receive so-called means of implementation, finance, technology, because their capacities are not sufficient very often to fulfill the commitments under these international treaties. And then, of course, these treaties require national implementation through legislation, policies, and measures. And the compliance regime, because when you are a member of such a treaty, you have to demonstrate that you are complying with the provisions of the treaties, require these reporting, reviewing of the information, and further measures that the treaty may decide towards a country that is not fulfilling its commitments. Just two remarks I have put here. As many of you are legal persons, I'm not, but I'm always astonished to see how the discussions are ongoing on the legal nature, the legally binding nature of these international treaties. Some call it soft law, others legally binding. I have in mind one recent paper from Professor Boisson de Chazolles from the University of Geneva about the Paris Agreement. Is it of legally binding nature or not, etc. Well, we leave here the discussion. And I repeat again, since the Rio summit in 1992, an important concept has emerged to capture the idea of different situations of capacities of countries, which is the so-called CBDR or CBDR-C, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Responsibilities because developed countries had their development on the basis of a strong exploitation of natural resources and pollution and so on, that is more recent in developing countries, and capacities, well, you know what it is. So in the next slide, please. We try to capture the elements that we may call incentives for countries to joining in environmental global treaties. Of course, one may expect that the main reason is the sincere wish to preserve the environment. As a matter of fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I have put 4 bullet points, but there is a good quotation of Edith Weiss that show that there is a lot of pressure of the international community, be it neighbors, partners, competitors, be it because it's very convenient for companies to play at the same level as competitors in other countries having the same legislation, and so on. And one important element is image. Nobody wants to be the rogue state that destroys the environment and doesn't care for it. But you know, the national interests in the same level of commitments is a very important factor. That's why traditionally, for example, the US was reluctant to join the Kyoto Protocol, so the predecessor of the Paris Agreement, because China had no obligations under the Kyoto Protocol to decrease CO2 emissions. So you see how this plays. In the next slide, please. I describe here in this flow chart a little bit the life of the international treaties. These are living institutions in the sense that we negotiate, we adopt global national objectives. There is an implementation of these objectives. There is a reporting. There is a compliance process. And when the treaty and the parties to the treaty notice that something is lacking, that the efficiency of the treaty is not enough, then we go to the initial point of global and national objectives, and we revise them. As you may imagine, and I have already mentioned, all these discussions are taking place under the scrutiny, the attention, and the strong lobbying from every kind of interests. I mean, the public opinion, because the future of our everyday's life is at stake. The NGOs that are promoting environmental protection, the scientific community that has also the knowledge, how it's going on, what are the risks, etc. But also sectors of the economy, and some of them that have very immediate interests that may be threatened. Let's think of the discussion on climate change and the big oil companies. So you see. But the treaties are living organisms, and in the next slide, please, you see in blue the basic initial provisions, objectives of the treaties in the course of the years, and in red you see amendments and improvements of these treaties. Why these amendments? Why these changes, these improvements? Because parties learn lessons, experience of implementation and the results, and because science is also evolving. I mean, think of the UNFCCC process, the Climate Convention process. The Climate Convention, when it was adopted in 1992, had a very vague objectives. But in the course of the year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with its reports, has shown that there was a need to limit the emissions, to respect a certain budget, a certain global carbon budget, in view of limiting the increase of temperature, and therefore limiting the risks for the planet and for the individual countries and so on. So you see, these treaties are living institutions, and the implementation is continuously improving. In the next slide, please. Yes, the summary of these international conditions is that the scientific information is very important when adopting legal texts in the international context. We have to refer to what we intend to do, why, and what we want to avoid. And so the scientific community is providing very valuable input. The public opinion, the political response and willingness of countries to engage to solve these issues is of the essence, of course. But also what is very important is the capacities of countries. And we said that countries have not the same capacities, are not on the same level. The World Bank, for example, according to income, groups countries in 4 categories: low, lower middle, upper middle, and high income countries. Fortunately, Switzerland is in these high income countries group that can, and I use on purpose the word that is very often used in the international negotiations, can afford implementing measures, because very often developing countries say, well, we cannot afford these. And during many years, it was the thinking of many that the environmental protection was a luxury that was only affordable by developed countries. The whole academic but practitioners' experience and the whole society experience is that development and environmental protection go hand by hand. And therefore, the concept of sustainable development and the adoption of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, that really put the framework of these discussions. So the multilateral environmental agreements take care of these differentiated capacities. by providing, on one hand, means of implementation, financial and technological resources, but also recognizing as a basic principle that there are common but differentiated responsibilities and capacities. So the international situation is already a first step introducing this internationalization in the system that then spread out until the national domestic implementation. So you see, we have a strong dependence of national implementation on the global level. And that's why we talk in this presentation about internationalization of policies. In the next slide, please. We have some examples. Cannot review all the treaties, but maybe some that are well known. The Climate Convention, in its principles about this differentiation of commitments, says explicitly that developed countries have to take the lead in combating climate change. Okay, the Montreal Protocol has a very pragmatic and practical and efficient. It's a really efficient and successful treaty, the Montreal Protocol. And the recipe is the establishment of this so-called multilateral fund. The technological challenge for the ozone-depleting substances is very simple. Some substances have to be banned, have to be phased out, and someone has to pay for it. Our rich countries pay for themselves. Developing countries are helped through a global fund for making this upgrade of technology. And the Convention on Biological Diversity that introduced very explicitly this conditionality on financing. Meaning, in other words, if developed countries don't provide the financial resources, then developing countries should somehow, how should I say, are a little less bound by their objectives. So you see, so de facto and the jure here, again, we have this text mainstreaming of the idea of the world where countries are in different situations, but also the internationalization of these policies at national level. The next slide, please. I come again back to a nice flow chart where, but you know that how things happen, how the country decided to ratify an international treaty, how to implement it. And I have put here the traditional steps. I refer very much, of course, to the Swiss experience I know well, in particular with this third blue box where I say launching a broad debate at the national level. In our democratic country, fortunately, we have this opportunity to have this broad debate that reach a consensus at the end and allows the country to go at the international arena with one position that then is implemented when the agreement and the objectives are agreed upon. But all of these processes, as usual, take place under a big scrutiny from the scientific world that presents scientific information about partners, the international pressure, different representatives of national interests in very specific niches, public opinion, the media, etc. So you know how it works. In the next slide, and I'm not going to insist very much, but I provide it to you for further reading. The example of Switzerland is described here, also with reference to the legal basis. I mean, what we do is in our democratic countries is always based on solid legal basis. Here, the constitution for Switzerland, which provides for cooperation with other countries for protection of the environment, for ratification of treaties, and attributes, of course, the responsibility of international policy and the negotiations to the federal government, the federal council. For those of you who wanted to have one specific example, I have mentioned here La Feuille Fédérale, so the systematic compendium of federal law, where the so-called message from the government, you see here in the lower picture in session, to the parliament in the above picture, details the agreement that Switzerland wants to do. Okay, in the next slide, I'm also not going to insist on the flow of the actions and the various steps. Imagine that this is something that is done for the adoption of the CO2 Act, the CO2 law, to implement the Paris Agreement. And at the end, you know that we have currently a popular referendum. We are going to vote on this. This is a very specific, peculiar, well appreciated popular right that we have in Switzerland, which is the people are at the top of the pyramid of decision making, and even laws that are adopted by the parliament can be challenged by the population, and we are going to vote. Okay, in the next slide, I'm going to insist in a kind of a double track for Switzerland in terms of internationalization. Switzerland has a big neighbor with which we want to have good relationships, and this is the European Union. So for Switzerland, it's not only a matter to internationalize global objectives and treaties and so on, the provisions of these treaties, but also what at the European regional level is happening. So we have this double track, and you see here how in particular in red there in the first lines of the slide, Switzerland is fully in line with the EU on climate change legislation, but also in other environmental matters. So de facto, again, an internationalization of Swiss legislation, this time vis-à-vis the European Union. In the next slide, please. I have put together elements that I will even don't dare in front of you legal persons comment, because it has to do with European, for me, very exhaustive elements. But being a practitioner, having worked now since more than 25 years with European colleagues, we see that they are empowered by the European Union to contract international treaties, become a party to international treaties, which is the case, for example, with the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, and so on. And then once the EU ratifies and the member countries ratify, this becomes law, and they have to do. So this internationalization of the next slide, please, it's the same information, but referring to the US. There too, I will not comment much of what I have copy-paste from the American Association on International Law, and they explain that once the US ratifies the treaty, then it implements it and becomes part of the national law. And I speak under your control. I have looked a little bit in the details, and when I read that treaties and other international agreements are subject to the Bill of Rights, I said, well, have in mind, you have always the Fifth Amendment or things like that. You see in every movie and so on. So I have been looking more in detail, and if I'm right, I think that the 12th Amendment says that for legislation, and many treaties have a self-implementing legislation that are so explicit that you don't need to go around and have an additional law. For many of these self-implementing provisions, apparently, but you will check, provides that if the federal government doesn't implement, then the states traditional federal approach with subsidiary principle, the states implement these. And it's interesting to see that even without having ratified the Kyoto Protocol and so on, since now many years, states in the United States have implemented a lot of climate legislation. The next slide, please. I show something that I have heard since many meetings, because we hear the colleagues, the legal colleagues making these presentations, and I'm referring to this very nice picture where they have compiled the number of climate and measure load policies. And you see in the yellow corner the burgeoning world that it is. I mean, we have a lot of laws and laws and laws and many laws. Okay, so this is also an internationalization of these global policies, global objectives, and so how countries become more and more embedded in these global system. Of course, one may wonder, but do all these laws guarantee that there is a real reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? Unfortunately, the situation is, for the time being, not so comfortable and satisfactory, but maybe some laws need time for yielding results. And in the next slide, we may, for the time being, stop here our consideration of this internationalization by wondering very philosophically if countries are losing their sovereignty when joining these international treaties and so on. Is already an old discussion, as you see. But I think an important milestone was this idea of the global commons, for which Mrs. Ostrom received as first woman in the history of Nobel Prizes, the Nobel Prize for Economy in 2009, for her contribution in the recognition that there are common goods. Although it's still disputed among my colleagues, lawyers, what the Stockholm Conference says about the sovereignty of natural resources. I mean, do I have the right as a sovereign country to deforest all I want because it's in my territory, knowing that deforestation impacts global biodiversity, but also climate change. Anyway, let's go to the process of considering implementation and compliance, because all these treaties have a section that, of course, provides for a compliance regime, whatever it means. Let's have a look. So again, the flow of responsibilities and actions is on the side of the treaty. We have a definition of the objectives. These objectives are lower part of the slide translated to the countries that through these internationalization of the objectives go for implementing actions at the domestic level. They monitor these actions, they look at the performance, and it's part of the compliance regime to have a reporting mechanism And it's interesting, these reporting mechanisms is measure something and you become aware. And certainly your behavior will change. I mean, just a little homework for all of us is have a look at your personal electricity bill. How much electricity, how much energy you use, and then maybe you will be inclined to provide for more efficient use of energy. So when we report, when we make the statistic, we become aware, we're incited to act better. Anyway, the reporting is then translated to the conference of the parties that review the information and decides what next steps have to be adopted for ensuring compliance by all countries and individual countries. The next slide, please. Again, Madam Weiss has a classification of compliance. Compliance may mean procedural compliance, so providing reports and all bureaucratic requirements. Compliance may mean substantive compliance, reaching targets and so on. And it may also mean very broadly respecting the spirit of the agreement. I mean, you cannot deforest at the same time claim that you are protecting the forest and the biodiversity. And so the scheme for the architecture for the treaty compliance regime is reporting, reviewing, assessing the reporting, and deciding what to do. And so procedural compliance and substantive compliance is judged easily, if we may say so, contemplating the reports parties provide. The next slide, please. I go through 3 examples to the idea of reporting. The UNFCCC requested the national communications, but with a differentiation in the reporting between developed and developing countries. You can consult, for example, in the UNFCCC website the 7th national communication in Switzerland, which is the latest one. The Paris Agreement is in a process which is trying to converge developed and developing countries' reports with a common framework, the enhanced transparency framework, but it's not yet completely sure that there will be only one reporting way. And the Basel Convention, which requests annual reports for ensuring that these movements of hazardous substances are under control. In the next slide, please. The review is then also provided for in the system of the treaties. Once again, the 3 agreements mentioned previously. I didn't mention, I do it now, that reporting and reviewing is done according to agreed guidelines. You cannot report by yourself what you want, but it's agreed to guidelines. So it ensures kind of legal consistency or legal security, if you wish, because then you are judged on the basis of what has been defined from you. And then the conference of the parties, in the next slide, please, go for assessing and supporting compliance. Assessing compliance and supporting compliance, because measures are very often of a facilitative nature. It's the case for UNFCCC. It's the case for the Paris Agreement. Although the Paris Agreement, on the basis of what we know from the Kyoto Protocol, if we enter in a carbon market, as the private sector will also enter into the market, maybe some legally binding parts of the implementation will be legally binding. So let's see how it develops. And the Basel Convention, that is helping countries to comply and giving them some tools for implementing sanctions at the national level if some provisions of the convention are not respected. The next slide, please. I go here for a reality check, if we may say so, of two of these conventions. The UNFCCC has recently, on 26 February, issued a synthesis report on the announcement of countries in terms of reduction of emissions, and the UNFCCC says, well, guys, you are not on track. I mean, nations must redouble efforts and submit stronger, more ambitious national climate action plans because emissions are still growing. And the Basel Convention has, as the UNFCCC, also successes and so on, but of course we focus on gaps. And something which is a real concern is the proliferation of marine plastic litter and microplastics that enter into the food chain and present for the environment, animals, and so on, but also for humans' health. In the next slide, please. I have found in this University of Massachusetts initiative on Environmental Convention Index a very nice picture of the state of assessment of the implementation of the Basel Convention on transboundary movements of hazardous substances. And the authors of this Environmental Convention Index have a number of ingredients in the index, but all in all, they provide this picture. Deep red, deeper green is good implementation. Yellow, red is bad implementation. To be noticed that the US is not a member of this. The next slide, please. I come to the conclusions, and the conclusions is, as I have been repeating as leitmotif of the presentation, a large part of countries' environmental policy is internationalized because it's implementation of international goals. There is no single recipe for ensuring the success of an environmental treaty. You have seen how many ingredients come into the recipe. What is certain is that there is a need for having a strong willingness to commit and to comply. And you know that the compliance regimes, as I have mentioned, are very often facilitative and so on. Don't go too much into sanctions and so on, because it's very difficult at the international level to compel compliance, to force countries to do something. What is evident is that there is a growing involvement and influence of many major groups, the youth, the local governments, trade unions, etc., to just transition, because we are talking about to transition into a world where sustainable development will be the rule. But for that, we need to accompany the economy, the workers, the people, the population. I mean, so this just transition is something that will be presented by some major groups. So these major groups are more and more influencing the processes, the international processes, and of course the national implementation. And my second part of the conclusion is presenting two what I would call the quadrilemmas. I mean, it's wonder how for a treaty to be ambitious, to ensure broad participation, to be consistent with sustainable development goals, that one part of the treaty doesn't destroy other parts of the environment, and to have and ensure sufficient compliance. And the second quadrilemma is on the parties, how to have a political willingness to implement, how to have the necessary capacities by themselves or get means of implementation from the international process, willingness to fulfill institutional and legal obligations, and to implement the treaty in an integrity and sustainable way, respecting what we have now as a chapter, the sustainable development. Thank you very much. I stop here. I'm sorry to have been a little bit long, but I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this excellent and very informative presentation. In your conclusion, you gave us, I would say, the main elements that all negotiators have to think of when they are elaborating an international text in order to achieve these sustainable development goals or whatever the topic. So I think it was very, very interesting to listen to you on the implementation and the compliance of these international texts. And I share the view that whether these texts are legally binding or just considered as soft law, of course, this is a legal discussion and very important in terms of legal theory, but at the very end, and you said it, at the very end, what is the most important is, of course, the effectiveness of the results that can be achieved through this international cooperation put into an international legal text. So it was very, very interesting to listen to you. Maybe with these words, I'll just look at the time. We have about 20 minutes for our discussion, and I am happy to open the floor. I would ask maybe the different participants just to take the floor. We did not go through the chat button. You may just raise your hand, and I will be distributing the time for the different participants. Who would like to start? Or comments, questions, observations? Yes, please. We have Mr. Matthew Kilgariff, a very close friend of mine, but friend of the MEIG program as well. So please, Matthew, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Kadu, and thank you, proper students, for allowing me to ask the first question. Thank you so much, Professor, for arranging this speaker. I found it fascinating, and just to let Mr. Romero understand, I'm working at Richemont here in Geneva. It's an international company with over 30,000 employees, and what I observed watching your presentation is the microcosm of a single company which has different divisions with different ambitions, and the cascading upwards and downwards and the difficulties of hard law and soft law. I'm experiencing exactly the same thing, trying to set science-based targets within my corporation to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. It's been 5 years, 6 years even, and the discussions continue. So I thought you would find it amusing to hear that within a single company, you have the microcosm of all those agreements and disagreements, treaties, allies, enemies, the common ground. So not really a question, but more a mark of my appreciation to hear that my difficulties are shared at the macro level as well around the world. And the irony is that this is all in Geneva. So thank you. Thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yes, maybe a very, very short answer.
Yes?
You know, something that the IPCC says is inertia. All systems have inertia. Those who have some established positions think that they may lose something. Innovation is a very courageous action, so inertia at all levels, and this is what is preventing progress.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I do have a I would say common question. What is your assessment in the different types of compliance provisions? You mentioned the different ones, and with your experience with all these texts, what is, in your view, the best, I would say, provision or the best method in order to give a very important incentive for the contracting party, for the states, for the different entities to implement and to respect these texts, because there are different methods. And what do you think it would be the best at the moment? Because probably depends at the period at which you are looking at. Yeah.
Yes, yes, thank you, Professor. It's a very wide, varied, diverse world when we talk about these environmental agreements. Some are very specific, and that's why I choose the Basel Convention, because there you can, as an employee at the border, a custom employee, look at what is transitioning from one country to another country. So this is very specific. And there, the implementation regime, in quotes, may be easy in the sense that you say, well, we need the inventory of what you are collecting in your country for exporting it. And then we have a look how this is exported if the country that receives that is under the regime of so-called prior informed consent, for example. If not, you are cheating, etc., etc., or you don't say how many tons you are exporting, and you say that you are exporting 1 ton, you are exporting 3 tons, and so on. So this is a very specific situation where you can have, I would say, a strong enforcement opportunity. Because it's simple and so on. When it comes to the Paris Agreement, of course, there are attempts to quantify the responsibility of the emissions. I mean, well, as a physicist, I don't bother you with that much, but think of emitting so many tons, megatons actually, because we emit a lot, transform it in terms of radiative forcing that remains in the atmosphere for X years, CO2 remains in the atmosphere more than 200 years, and then we can couple and derive how much the temperature increases because these emissions. So you can have a link and so on. So we could go for a regime, a compliance regime, saying you have emitted so much, you are responsible of so much, you have to decrease so much in order to stabilize at 1.5. But you see the difficulty of the system that we would have to put in place. So this regime is more complicated. So we go through the facilitative way, a little bit the carrot by providing soft incentive, financial incentives, technical incentives, and the stick, because reputation. I mean, oh, you are a bad guy and so on. And I mentioned, for example, the border tax adjustment and so on is a mythical measure that it's very difficult to implement. But we know that some retaliation measures are taken on the basis of political disputes between, I mean, we heard that President Trump, for example, had a lot of retaliation against China on products, against the European Union on wines and champagne and so on and so on, but not exactly for environmental purposes. For environmental purposes would be something new, but this would be one way to I mean, rough way to implement measures. I think that European Union was talking with the aviation sector to have a tax, and I was consulted, for example, for estimating the tax between Frankfurt and Bangkok. You was thinking of something, and I estimated something $70 or 70 euros for a tax and so on. But this is difficult at the international level. It can be done at the national level. Coming back to the tax on aviation, you know that the current CO2 law that is subject to referendum is introducing an aviation tax for the Swiss population. So somehow there is a kind of providing countries with incentives for themselves to have the compliance regime put in place, because at the national level is very often very complicated. So again, to your questions, my answer would be not conclusive, but there is a broad range of treaties with a broad range of very specific targets and means to measure fulfilling the target or not. And therefore, it's a big challenge to establish general provisions for a unique regime. So one doesn't fit all. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this answer. I see that we have two questions. Maybe Badi Balaki Wembi first, and then Boris. Please, Badi Balaki, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Yes,
Good morning, Dr. Jose. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Badi Balaki Wembe from Togo. I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dealing actually with political affairs. So in your conclusion, I heard that there is no mean to compel any party to comply with the provision of a treaty, yes, which is due to the nature of those treaties, because countries are negotiating regarding their capacities and all their interests. We can understand that. But don't you think that outside of the agreement, the international community and all the actors can find a mean to oblige all actors, especially upstream and downstream companies, to comply with environmental policies? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Badi. But I suggest that we take the second question as well, Dr. Romero, if you agree, and then we can start answering. Please, Boris.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Romero, for your presentation and for this informative talk. I'm Boris from Armenia, participant of the MEIG program. You mentioned about the lobbying and various interests involved in the negotiations of climate change instruments, and thus these various interests also kind of make this a living instrument, as far as I understood from your presentation. So I would like to learn your opinion. What do you think? Would it be an exaggerated assumption that businesses who influence politics by directly financing politics and lobbying, and also they affect science in a sense of financing science, and thus through science they might also influence the public opinion? Do you think they have more kind of weight in affecting the climate change negotiations than the, I don't know, the civil society maybe, which forms the electoral basis? And maybe it would be difficult to state this opinion in general, because maybe it depends on the country, but maybe on the example of Switzerland, you could provide an opinion. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Professor. May I?
Yes, please. Please.
For the first question, I said that there are a number of elements that we call them incentives to join the treaties, and I also mentioned a number of elements that are facilitative. I said the carrot, the part of the carrot, that is the support of these means of implementation that the treaties provide for. And for climate change, for example, for biodiversity and for ozone, it's clear that there is money. For climate, there were the traditional Global Environment Facility, but then we established the Green Climate Fund in 2010. And so there is money for provision of technology and so on. The same for the Montreal Protocol. Now, I mentioned also a number of additional incentives. I'll take the case of Switzerland, because we are, for example, and I speak under your control, Professor, we are in this bilateral agreement with the European Union. It would be very strange for Switzerland not to be implementing climate policy and having a bilateral agreement on environment and so on with the European Union. So the Union would say, no, you have to. So, you know, the pressure, the international pressure for the companies, for our business, they would be penalized because the Union would say, well, the Swiss companies don't respect environmental goals and etc. So don't come and operate here in the Union and so on. So you see, so this is a soft, hard way to exert pressure on the country. So this is the hard way. The soft way, which is generally the one used towards developing countries, is what I call the carrot, with all respect, is the provision of means of implementation. So facilitative means, technical advice, transfer of technology, transfer of financial means, respecting their national priorities, in respecting also their rhythm, because some countries need more years to implement and to get results from legislation than others, and so on. So I think that we have now globally, collectively, enough experience what works, what doesn't work. It doesn't work to go to one developing country, and even in our countries, from the treaty and come and say, now you receive this target and you have absolutely to. No, it doesn't work that way. It's a process of negotiating, and even the Paris Agreement has installed the so-called NDCs, the nationally determined contribution. It doesn't talk even of targets, but it's nationally, it's a bottom-up. It's a bottom-up. Believe me, that is a full change of paradigm towards the Kyoto Protocol. I have negotiated for Switzerland, the Kyoto 1, Kyoto 2, which was top-down. So we joined together and we decide what targets have then to go to the country. But now in the Paris Agreement is bottom-up. So every country brings its NDC. This is for the first question. For the second question, I would say that, you know, and I have spent in my life as a negotiator for Switzerland, the scientist for Switzerland, much time talking to all stakeholders, in particular to the colleagues from the business. And the first people around the International Chamber of Commerce, if you wish, that are federated. The first thing they say is, well, the business is not only one business. You have a broad range of interests and so on. And even in Geneva, we are talking about Geneva, we have the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is, I would say, the most progressive part of all these companies, because they know that sooner or later, the technological process, the legislative process, the sustainable development trend, the legislations, national, international, and so on, would make that some progress is needed. And many years ago already, British Petroleum declared themselves as an energy company. At the end, the business would say, well, it doesn't matter where the income comes from. We may sell oil, but if it is forbidden, then we go for renewable energy. The point is having some interesting business model that fits in what is required, what is allowed, what is also the. So in that sense, I would not say that the business as such, which is multiple, has a multiplicity of aspects, is more powerful in lobbying than the public opinion. Look at what all these young people around the world are doing for climate. We have new social means. I mean, we are using ourselves internet. So look at new. I don't dare to compare, but societal moves are very quick now, and you may expect big influences. And once again, I don't dare to compare, but look at the Me Too and the liberation of the speech. So these kind of societal trends may be very powerful. So I don't think that there are bad guys of the business in the corner of the room trying to lobby and influence and so on and so on. The world is more complex, and we in the environment work with kind of testimony for Switzerland with the bank associations, insurance association, Sem Suisse, for example, the cement producers, and all these people, Economy Suisse, of course. All these people are looking, well, how can we fit? The point is to discuss and to reach an agreement. Maybe they need time. Maybe they need more time than what is provided for at the beginning in the initial proposal by the government. But this has to be discussed. No, we can shift the business model, but we need a little bit more time. Okay, you request these technologies, but maybe we have even better technologies. I have discussions on these matters with colleagues from the Montreal Protocol, and the people from the chemistry industry, they say, but look, we have better components available immediately that the ones you are thinking of. So this dialogue is necessary. So I don't think that there is definitely there is always an attempt to lobby for own interests from all groups, for sure. But I think that the model now is everything is open, and we know what people from one sector want. We know what the others want, and we know how adaptive also the business is in our open economies societies, in our democratic societies. Because at the end, the business is not outside the law. And if there is a CO2 law in Switzerland, everybody has to respect the law. And there are provisions for all sectors. You mentioned Sem Suisse and the cement producer with Holcim, which are very willing to undertake actions since decades, since the first version of the CO2 law in Switzerland, but also the aviation sector and so on. So I think that we are reaching now a better understanding about sustainability is necessary, and everybody has to go hand in hand. Because sustainability, don't forget, is the three poles: social, economy,
and environment.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for this presentation, and thank you so much for the discussion we just had on this compliance implementation, which is of course one of the most difficult issue when we come to discussing the achievement of the goals. Thank you to all participants for being with us today. A warm thank to Dr. Romero for this excellent presentation. And with these words, I would like to close this session and invite you to follow us on the different websites for our next conferences at this same time of the day. Thank you to all, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.